happy that we have Mr. Srinath Reddy and Mr. Mushkil Dubey with us to discuss the viability of universal health coverage in our country. Today we have Professor Srinath Reddy. You know, if you have followed the series, you will know that most of our speakers are very interdisciplinary in their approach. Like even as they specialize in one area, they are all the time trying to connect their fields with other fields of knowledge and creativity. So we have Srinath, who's talking about health coverage, which is a very important thing in India. It's a kind of extension of our last lecture by Harsh Mandar, who talked about the question of equity and homelessness and poverty. That was what he addressed. So this is Srinath's lecture is today extending that discourse to see how equity can be made possible in this field of health. And he is presently the president of Public Health Foundation in India, and he formerly headed the Department of Cardiology at AIIMS. And the Public Health Foundation of India is engaged in capacity building in public health in India through education, training, research, policy development, communication and advocacy. His work and leadership in these areas of health and human rights, you know, he's working across the world actually, you know, being part of a lot of initiatives across the world. This really inspired us. He's part of a lot of initiatives like this. I don't want to go through his biodata and, you know, give you those kind of information, but what is important for us is his work in the field of health is not really limited to the area of health, but, you know, his work is connected with various disciplines, from economics to international relations. There are a lot of connections that he has achieved through his work. That is very, very seminal for an organization like LEELA. I welcome you, Srinath, for this. You know, this is the last lecture in the series, and we're very privileged to have you. And Professor Mushkil Dubey is former Foreign Secretary to the Government of India, and he's president of the Council for Social Development and chairman of the Asian Development Research Institute in Patna. He teaches international relations at JNU. And former ambassador, he's also professor emeritus at the Foreign Service Institute. He's currently researching on, even when you look at his work also, it's like a wide variety of things that he's engaged with, you know, researching on issues related to economy, security, trading systems and international relations. I welcome Professor Dubey to this. We are indeed honored to have you here, sir. And I invite you to take. Thank you very much.
This institution where he has brought his great sense of social justice and equality to bear on the work that he has done. And this is very well reflected in his landmark report on universalizing healthcare, which he submitted on behalf of the high-level expert group set up by the Planning Commission on the eve of the finalization of the plan. And I, for one, had hoped that provided the nation a very good opening to launch a scheme for universalizing healthcare. Unfortunately, that could not come to pass for reasons I would not like to go in this meeting. But it will remain a landmark contribution. And I think it will be extremely useful for you all here to get to know the essential elements of that scheme, and also Professor Reddy's views on the whole issue of universalizing healthcare, which has been one of the longest pending agenda of India's social development, and one of the most important agendas that one can think of. So with the introductory words, I would request Professor Reddy to deliver.
Professor Dubey, ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed a privilege to be here on a cold wintry evening when the last of the Leela Pratham lectures are now to be delivered. Indeed, I'm grateful to the learned audience for having come here, because we require the collective energy and engagement of a large number of people to discuss and debate the issue related to universal health coverage, so that one of the major challenges that is now posed to our development can be sorted out. Universal health coverage is something that has now become a part of the global discourse for a variety of reasons. Firstly, universal health coverage is not a new concept. It evolved during the Bismarckian times, when in order to protect labor productivity, as well as in order to ensure that Imperial Germany had healthy human resources to extend its imperial ambitions, Bismarck certainly introduced what were then considered to be landmark reforms in terms of access to health care. Of course, there were also major social movements of that time sweeping across Europe, which also provided the catalytic stimulus for these kind of reforms to come in. And then we saw in the United Kingdom, for a period of time, the Beveridge report coming forth, and then forming the basis for introduction of the National Health Service by Angell and Bevan. Subsequently, many other countries have traversed that path through one model or other, whether it was a complete manifestation of universal health coverage in a welfare state, or embedded within the framework of a socialist economy, or even in other countries which are not exactly welfare states. And now we find, apart from Europe, a large number of low and middle income countries now moving towards universal health coverage. China declared last year that it has achieved 96% coverage of its 3 insurance schemes, while having neglected health during the period of its liberalization. It recognized that health indicators were slipping, and people were actually protesting the lack of access to health care, especially in rural China. And therefore, in 2009, the Chinese reforms which came in have now adopted universal health coverage as an important mission. We have had universal health coverage implemented in Thailand, in Mexico, and several other countries like Turkey. These are some of the important examples where the model has been successfully introduced and at least substantially implemented. Others have announced their commitment to universal health coverage, and one among them is India, which in the 12th plan adopted in 2012 also said universal health coverage would be the major guiding principle of the National Health Mission. Now we'll have to see how far we have come across in that commitment. Firstly, of course, we must recognize the importance of health in development and why societies invest in health. The utilitarian view is that health is important for productivity, which Bismarck certainly recognized, and others have since then. But health has both instrumental value and intrinsic value. It has an instrumental value for increased productivity, also for enabling access to education, and so on. But there is also the well-being view that health is intrinsically good. It is required for personal happiness and family happiness, when a person feels that he or she can enjoy life because of unimpeded health, which in a sense is necessary for deriving the full benefit of a fulfilling life. At the same time, there has been an important move towards looking at health from the global security point of view. Indeed, in the late 90s, we have seen the threat of bioterrorism, the spread of SARS, HIV/AIDS, the threat of H1N1, H5N1, uniting countries not only in terms of the traditional international health regulations, but in terms of agreements to try and limit the spread of many of these epidemics because of the shared vulnerability that they feared. And indeed, even in December 2012, when the United Nations held a major meeting on foreign policy and health, universal health coverage came up front and foremost as one of the important elements to be stressed for global well-being and even from the international foreign policy relations point of view. So we have seen health and universal health coverage as a part of that become a part of the global discourse. Now in 2015, when the United Nations will now frame its sustainable development goals, the front runner at the moment is universal health coverage. But there is also a human rights view which goes beyond mere productivity or even the personal well-being aspect of it, and certainly moves beyond shared vulnerability. It is the respect for health as an important component of human dignity, and recognizing that solidarity within societies and across countries is absolutely necessary in order to promote health, to protect the life of human beings and their right to live their lives with dignity. And therefore, we've now moved from a relatively narrow paradigm of shared vulnerability to shared values, which certainly is a civilizational advance. But even in terms of health equity, where we are talking about equity as a fundamental underlying principle or the platform for universal health coverage, we have seen how this has evolved from the utilitarian philosophy of Jeremy Bentham to the social justice theory of John Rawls. Now, John Rawls, of course, came up with very strong advocacy for social justice, but mainly on the basis of personal liberties and shared freedoms of societies. Indeed, health did not feature in his discourse, but he did espouse the cause of equality from the point of view of freedom and liberty, and therefore, in that sense, the liberal interpretation of what is a fair society in terms of social justice and fairness could also be applied to health. But Sen extended it certainly from fairness to justice, and then talked about capabilities and rights. But particularly he said it's important to look at capabilities. And the whole concept of rights, of course, becomes a little difficult unless we start defining what that right encompasses. Otherwise, it would appear to be extraordinarily nebulous. However aspirational it may be, it would become ill-defined. But then it becomes easier to define that right in terms of capability, and Sridhar Venkatapuram does a very good job of extending what Sen meant into a formulation where he says, a well-ordered society would ensure that all individuals have the capability to be healthy and at a level that is commensurate with human dignity in the modern world, which is their right. Therefore, how to translate that capability into a right is somewhat answered here. But this right is not a unitary right. It is a cluster of several rights, because health is determined by so many determinants that it actually encompasses several rights which have to be unified in order to attain that capability. So as Judith Thomson said, it includes multiple and diverse entitlements to goods, liberties, powers, privileges, and immunities. And that translates into a meta-capability, which is an overarching capability to achieve a cluster of basic capabilities, to be and to do things that make up a minimally good human life in the contemporary world. Now, what is this meta-capability or the capability may vary according to populations, according to cultures, according to different contexts. So Amartya Sen, apart from defining a basic minimum set, leaves it open to interpretation and selection by different countries, unlike Martha Nussbaum, who confines it to 10 defined capabilities. But nevertheless, the important thing is to recognize the ability to attain that meta-capability, which then translates into a life of dignity, and therefore requires health as a fundamental platform for that, is something that we have to recognize when we are proceeding to discuss universal health coverage. So when we are really discussing the construct of health equity, as somebody said, William Gibson actually said it, the future is already here. It is not very evenly distributed. Now, the fact is that we live in very unequal societies, where some sections of the society have excellent health conditions because they benefited substantially from unequal access not only to health services, but to other social benefits. Therefore, if we really want to establish equity in terms of health, we need universal health coverage most certainly, of which financial protection is one element. It is necessary but not sufficient. We also require to pay attention to the social determinants of health, and I shall elaborate this further, and therefore it requires multi-sectoral action. It also requires empowered communities which then adopt a rights-based approach to health. Now, we traditionally look at the health system in the WHO's definition as including the workforce, the health workforce, from doctors to community health workers, the health infrastructure, access to drugs, vaccines and technologies, health financing, health information systems, and the governance of the health system, which includes transparency, accountability, lack of corruption, efficiency, and so on. At the same time, there are the social determinants of health, because health is impacted upon by developments in many other sectors, often more so than in the health sector. And these can be at the societal level, like water, sanitation, the food system, environment, social stability, development, or at the personal level, like income, education, occupation, social status of an individual, not only caste, but other forms of social status, gender, the ability to participate in networks, and so on. But while we have conveniently divided this into the health system and the social determinants, underlying this is the whole political and economic system, which determines to what extent the health system and the social determinants are geared towards equity. And unless we actually start discussing how committed is the political and economic system to multidimensional equity, we will not be able to really understand the coordinates of the health system or the social determinants of health vis-a-vis universal health coverage. Traditionally, as even John Rawls had stated, we look at it as equality of opportunity, like the ability to access health services without difficulty. Now, the equality of opportunity does not take into account equality of social circumstances. Now, Tawney, who was a British economist in 1931 from the London School of Economics, actually takes issue with this. He says with massive inequalities, where many are denied an adequate education, unable to access effective health care, and housed in slums, equality of opportunity is nothing more than a cruel jest, the impertinent courtesy of an invitation offered to unwelcome guests in the certainty that circumstances will prevent them from accepting it. He indeed says, what is required is not only an open road, but an equal start. So, this is where we have to recognize that merely providing access to health services will not suffice. What are the conditions that created ill health in the first place, and whether those determinants could also be geared towards health equity, and even whether the social circumstances by which a person may be able to access and benefit from health services can also be geared towards health equity. Those are some of the questions that we need to answer. And this is where the social determinants of health define conditions under which individuals can get an equal start and run the race without handicap. Now, in that context, against that background of health equity, let's examine where India's health status is. And here, I would like to apologize in advance, because the facts that I'm going to state are not going to be very pleasant. But then, I take it that India's national bird is the peacock and not the ostrich. So we need not shy away from facing unpleasant facts. India gained 30 years in life expectancy since independence. That's a remarkable achievement. However, this is not equitably distributed across the country. Life expectancy is 57 years in Madhya Pradesh, 74 years in Kerala. And also, India is underperforming when compared to its income group peers in health. If you see where India is and where Bangladesh is, Bangladesh with a lower per capita income has a higher life expectancy, as do some other countries with equal or lower per capita income. We lose about 4,000 infants every day, equivalent to 12 full jumbo jets crashing every day. If you look at infant mortality rate, Thailand has an IMR of 11, Sri Lanka 14, China 16, Brazil 17, Nepal 41, Bangladesh 38, and India at 48 at that time of comparison, so it's now come down to 42. But at the time of comparison, it was behind Nepal, behind Bangladesh, and we are actually worse than Botswana. So we do have a major issue here in terms of our IMR still being pretty poor compared to our economic indicators. And while most countries have shown a decline in infant mortality rate, India has lagged behind in terms of its rate of decline. As compared to Bangladesh's rate of decline being 67% between 1990 and 2012, Nepal's being 66%, India's rate of decline has been only 50%. There's been some improvement in the last couple of years because of the NRHM, but still it is not comparable to our neighbors. When we look at basic immunization, the proportion of our children who are not fully immunized is ranging according to various estimates from 50 to 67%. Even taking the better estimate of 67%, we recognize that a third of our children are not fully immunized. Even at the height of its civil conflict, Sri Lanka had 99% immunization. Ghana has 94%. Bangladesh has 95%. So we are certainly worse off than many of our neighbors as well as other peers, and not even comparable to many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And when we come to undernutrition, about 43% of our children who survive the first year are underweight by 3, and 66% of them are anemic. And this is something that our Prime Minister called a national shame. I mean, when you look at the percentage underweight below 5, India with 43% compares very poorly with Brazil with 2%, Ghana with 14%, Sri Lanka with 22%. Now this is the level of comparison that we have in comparison with even sub-Saharan Africa as well as with our immediate neighbors. Our maternal mortality rate is 4 times that of China and Brazil and 6 times that of Sri Lanka. Tuberculosis continues to remain a major problem, with 1/3 of the global cases of tuberculosis being in India, and drug-resistant tuberculosis now emerging as a major threat. When it comes to malaria, the estimates vary very widely. The website of the National Vector-Borne Control Program will have you believe that the annual mortality due to malaria is 753 deaths. An independent study done by some other group put it at more than 100,000. So the Health Ministry appointed a committee to look into this and said, what is the actual number of malaria deaths? And they came up with a figure close to 40,000 as an average. They said it ranges between 35,000 to 48,000, and they put it at 40,000 as a conservative estimate. That still has not been accepted as an official figure. It's not the numbers that we're quibbling about, it's the fact that we do not have health information systems which can provide valid estimates for policy planning and program evaluation. And that itself is a major shame in a country which is now supposed to be one of the leaders in information technology and heading towards a very strong knowledge economy. At the same time, we find chronic non-communicable diseases rising very rapidly in India, with diseases such as diabetes and others rising very rapidly. We have about 62 million persons with diabetes currently, and this will rise to 101 million persons with diabetes by 2030. Because of premature cardiovascular deaths, and cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death now in India. And many of the deaths occur below the age of 64 years. In terms of the productive person years of life lost due to premature deaths in the age group of 35 to 64, India lost 9.2 million in year 2000. It is projected to lose about 18 million by year 2030. This is 570% more than the United States for the same age band in 2000, and 900% more than the United States for the same age band in 2030. No country which aspires for accelerated economic development and positions itself as the potential economic power of the 21st century can afford such a hemorrhaging of human resources in the productive prime of midlife. Yet our health system is now having to combat these multiple challenges simultaneously and is grossly under-resourced. In terms of inequity, we see a huge amount of inequity within the country. A girl baby born in Madhya Pradesh is 5 times more likely to die before her first birthday than a girl baby born in Kerala. And in terms of the neonatal mortality, that is the death in the first month of life, the baby born in Odisha is 6 times more likely to die than a baby born in Kerala in the first month of life. Now this is inequity which is reflected across multiple divides. Whichever the health indicator that we take, we see urban-rural differences, differences across income strata, education strata, gender and caste strata. If you take caste, you see a stepladder pattern for any health indicator virtually, or between scheduled tribes, scheduled caste, other backward castes, and then upper caste. So there is a definite inequality that we see, which is multidimensional. While urban areas fare better than rural areas, the urban poor don't do very well. And when you compare with the rest of the urban population, whether it is immunization rates, or children underweight, or skilled birth attendance, or even access to piped water and use of sanitary toilets, the urban poor are greatly disadvantaged. When it comes to quality of primary care, which is the basis for health care, and here is a study that was conducted by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which scored for 6 criteria: 24-hour availability of services, clinical staff in position, training in past 5 years, basic infrastructure, equipment, essential drugs. When we looked at all of these, then in terms of, in India, India is scored overall 52%. The low-performing states scored 48%, and even the high-performing states did not score very high, 57%. So primary health care remains one of our major problems. And it's not surprising again, when we look at the state of facilities, a recent publication from WHO says a lack of regular water supply, 12% of PHCs, 28% of sub-centers, no electricity, 14% of PHCs, 29% of sub-centers, lack of all-weather motorable road, again a problem, no telephone in 54% of primary healthcare centers. So with this level of functioning, how do we expect healthcare services to be delivered with efficiency? At the same time, our expenditure on public health is very low. When we take per capita public health expenditure, then we spend half as much as Sri Lanka, a third as much as China, and a fourth as much as Thailand. Recognizing several of these are middle-income countries, we still spend far less than we ought to be spending. And this has a consequence in terms of out-of-pocket expenditure. About 70% of the health expenditure in the country is personal, private, out-of-pocket. And this is among the highest in the world. We are in the bottom 10 league of the world in terms of out-of-pocket expenditure. And it's been estimated that in 2011, over 60 million people were thrown into poverty or crushed below the poverty line because of the high out-of-pocket expenditure on health. Over 40% of the hospitalized persons had to borrow money or sell assets to pay for their care. And 28% of rural residents and 20% of urban residents did not even try to access health care because they felt they had no funds. And while many of the government-funded insurance schemes are now focusing substantially on hospitalized care, the fact of the matter is that much of the out-of-pocket expenditure is derived from outpatient expenditure, 76%. And a lot of it comes from expenditure on medicines, 72%. And over the years, the free supply of medicines has declined, even in public hospitals, both in inpatient and outpatient services. Compared to 86-87, to 2004, the free supply of medicines in hospital declined from 31% to 9%. And outpatient area, the free supplies declined from about 18% to 5.3%. When it comes to hospital bed capacity, compared to Sri Lanka's 3.1 per thousand population or China's 3 per thousand population, we have 0.9 per thousand population. Now, it is not necessary that we should have very many beds in an era where we are moving towards daycare and short hospitalization, but even then we will possibly need about 2.2 beds per thousand population. And the private sector has grown very dominant by default because of the neglect of the public sector, because of the lack of funding and the lack of adequate emphasis on quality of services. 80% of our hospitals are in the private sector. 63% of the total functional beds are in the private sector, and most of these are urban aggregated. And the private sector has widely varying credentials and quality, while the corporate hospitals do claim, and with some justification, expertise of a high order. We find that the private sector, whether it is nursing homes, small nursing homes, or individual private practitioners, have questionable in terms of their practices. Now, in terms of health worker density across major states of India, we see a huge maldistribution here. The North Indian, Central Indian, and Northeastern states have very few doctors or other health workers, and even the medical colleges are very few. The medical colleges are mainly concentrated in the 4 southern states and in Maharashtra. By 2020, by following the norms that are set for the population by WHO, we'll need 4 lakh more doctors, 16.2 lakh more nurses, and even now, there are 64 lakh vacancies in the allied health professional space. When I talk about allied health professionals, I'm talking likely about optometrists, radiographers, lab technicians, mental health counselors, physiotherapists, and so on. So there's a potential for employing 64 lakh people now in that space. Again, this is not to say that we need a doctor-centric model, certainly not in primary health care. But it is to say that if we were to follow the traditional norms, we are way behind. So we'll have to look at other ways of delivering these services. But at the same time, once again, to emphasize that we need to look at multisectorality as a very important element. As the Nobel laureate Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal said, health leaps out of science and draws nourishment from the totality of society. So policies and programs in finance, water, sanitation, agriculture, food processing, education, rural development, urban design, transport, communications, trade, environment, all of these need to become sensitive and responsive to public health concerns. Finance, not only in terms of allocation of resources to health, taxation of tobacco is probably the most powerful instrument to reduce tobacco consumption. And there are very many other examples I can give from other sectors. Of course, the country has responded through the National Rural Health Mission in order to try and increase the outreach of services and bridge the equity gaps. It has certainly extended services to many of the previously underserved areas. It has brought in a greater degree of decentralization and flexibility of allocation as well as spending of funds. It has activated a large number of social health activists, the ASHA, in the villages, 1 million of them now. However, it has remained almost exclusively focused on maternal and child health, and other primary health care needs have not been addressed. And even in maternal and child health, the incentives given for institutional delivery have not ensured that the woman who comes to the institution has adequate institutional care, either in terms of availability of trained human resources or infrastructure. So you have the poignant tragedy of a woman dying at the primary health center or community health center rather than at home. Then the impact on out-of-pocket expenditure has not been demonstrated. And most importantly, the continuum of care between primary, secondary, and tertiary care has not been established because care still remains fragmented. The Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana has aimed at financial protection. It has provided 30,000 rupees per family for a year for institutionalized care, that is hospitalized care, for a large number of secondary care procedures. Now, while this again has been useful in providing some level of care where needed and benefited some of the people who require life-saving treatments, the fact remains that this particular financial protection scheme does not focus on primary health care, does not link primary health care to secondary health care, continues to fragment services, has resulted in a substantial flow of public funds to private hospitals without enabling public sector hospitals to strengthen themselves, and has not adequately checked induced care. We have seen, whether it's Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana or the Arogya Shri, a large number of unnecessary hysterectomies being performed in women in reproductive age group in Andhra Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, and so on. So induced care is a major issue. And equally importantly, well-done studies reveal that out-of-pocket expenditure has not actually decreased. Catastrophic health counts has not decreased, because while your 30,000 rupees might cover your hospital expenditure, there are add-on hospital costs, there are post-hospitalization costs which are not covered. Therefore, this, while being useful, cannot be seen as a complete solution to the delivery of universal health coverage. So, a high-level expert group was constituted in October 2010 by the Government of India, and I was asked to chair it, and with 15 colleagues, we submitted a report in November 2011. But the big question is, what is universal health coverage? Our terms of reference were set for looking at human resources, access to health services, planning management reforms, community participation for health, enhancing access to essential drugs and vaccines, and health financing and financial protection. Social determinants were missing from our terms of reference, but the committee said we need to flag social determinants because they are very important. How can we talk about health without talking about water, sanitation, nutrition, and environment? We did not go into depth, but nevertheless we flagged these as important. But still the question is, what is universal health coverage? Universal health coverage is defined by different people and understood by different people in very many ways. Some people only look at it very narrowly as health insurance or some other model of financial protection. Some others look at it as access to a wide range of services, including preventive and promotive. Some others include even social determinants under universal health coverage. So what is it that we need to do? So when we set out looking at the definitions, we were confronted with the problem that Alice was confronted in Looking Glass. Humpty Dumpty said, I can make words mean anything I like. And Alice questions, how can you do that? Words must mean something, and how can you make words mean anything you like? Then, of course, Humpty Dumpty answers, that depends on who the master is. So, depends on who exactly is defining it. So, in terms of universal health coverage is when all people receive the quality health services they need without suffering financial hardship. This is the most concise definition given by the World Health Organization. Emphasis is on all people, the emphasis is on quality health services and protection from financial hardship. Now, in terms of financial hardship, we are again coming back to financial protection as the key element. So it narrows down the scope. And the WHO says this has three elements. Who is covered in the population? How many people are covered? Services. Which services are covered? What is the breadth of services? What is the depth of services? The range of services. Now, what is the financial protection? What do people have to pay out of pocket? So that is the financial protection element of it. Now, as far as the politicians are concerned, they will be mainly concerned with who is covered, because they would like to maximize the number of grateful beneficiaries. In terms of health professionals, they would like to see as many services covered, because they would like to have as many services from primary to tertiary care, because they would like to give as much of care as possible and as many services at their availability. As far as health planners and economists are concerned, particularly the bureaucrats who will have to handle the budgets, they are worried about financial protection, not only from the equity point of view, but from the affordability point of view. They can't allow the fiscal space to be exceeded by extravagant healthcare expenditure on universal health coverage. They will have to contain the healthcare costs. But the people want all of it. The people want everybody to be covered, as many services as needed to be provided, and as much financial protection as possible to be provided. And that is where we have to recognize the fact that we have to start in each of these three dimensions, but we may not be able to fill the queue all at once. We have to start by having a certain number of beneficiaries who will be covered by all the services, but at least primary health services being provided to all the beneficiaries, and then start increasing the number of services to others, and even services we may have to contain. We cannot give all the services to everybody, but then progressively start scaling it up. And then, in terms of financial protection, you may say that I would like to reduce out-of-pocket expenditure from 70% to 50% as the first goal, and then possibly bring it down to 30%, and then see how much can actually be afforded by the overall financial system. So our definition of universal health coverage for our report was ensuring equitable access to all Indian citizens, to affordable, accountable and appropriate assured quality health services, as well as public health services addressing the wider determinants of health, like water, sanitation, etc., with the government being the guarantor and the enabler, although not necessarily the only provider of health and related services. We said the government must take up the responsibility, but we also recognize that we have now evolved into a mixed health system. You cannot completely depend only on the public sector services now to provide all the services required, because you have to now bring in the private sector in a responsible manner, in a well-regulated framework, but with the public sector being strengthened and being in the lead, and the government setting the terms. So the guiding principles were universality, equity, non-exclusion and non-discrimination, comprehensive care that is rational and of good quality, financial protection, protection of patients' rights that guarantees appropriateness of care, patient choice, portability. And a citizen moving from one part of the country to the other part of the country should not be disadvantaged by the fact it's only a state insurance scheme. It should have the portability and continuity of care, consolidated and strengthened public health provisioning, accountability and transparency, and community participation. These are all fairly sound values, but how do they translate into actual practice? Firstly, why universality? A lot of people have questioned this. Why can't we have targeted programs only for the poor? Firstly, we must recognize that inequity does not occur in a dichotomous manner between people who are disadvantaged and people who are advantaged. It actually spreads across the entire society, and different income groups and different social groups have different levels of inequality compared to the highest income group or the most advantaged group. It is not as though the middle class is fully advantaged. It has its disadvantages. And as Michael Marmot has shown in his WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, you have to address this continuum of equity gap if you would really want to get the society move towards health equity. Secondly, Kate Prickett and Richard Wilkinson have shown in a very similar book called The Spirit Level that unequal societies fare worse than equal societies. Not only the poor in unequal societies fare badly, but even the rich in unequal societies fare worse than comparable rich in equal societies at the same level of income. So inequality across a society hurts everybody. So we need universality. The other reason why we need programs which are universal is that programs designed only for the poor are poor in design and delivery, usually, because there is no consensus across society for either adequate resourcing or for sustainability. So unless all of society has a stake in the system, it's not going to succeed. So universality looks at coverage in terms of breadth and depth. Equity is different. Equity looks at bridging gaps. It looks at horizontal equity, is everybody being treated on a level playing field, but it does not rule out an additional element of targeting within that framework, because you can still look at vertical equity, trying to reduce the gaps of the most disadvantaged sections. So a certain level of equality is to be assured, but there can be built-in targeting as well for certain other services. So our recommendations were to adopt universal health coverage as a national commitment to be initiated in 2012 and fulfilled by 2022. Commit 2.5% of the GDP as public financing for health during the 12th plan, and suggest that the Ministry of Health prepare a roadmap. Prioritize primary health care for financing and human resource development and deployment. Since we can't do everything all at once, make sure that primary health care, which is the fundamental bulwark of health in a society, is adequately protected and resourced. It should provide the basic services which will not only limit the amount of disease that requires secondary and tertiary care, but will also act as a responsible gatekeeper for appropriate referral, so that you don't find everybody crashing into the tertiary care center for even primary care complaints. Now, conduct a review of government-funded insurance schemes and to propose a plan for their integration into the overall framework of universal health coverage. To provide essential drugs free of cost. To provide credible and effective regulatory systems for administering universal health coverage in terms of accreditation, standards, financing, drugs, information systems, monitoring and evaluation. Both for private sector and for public sector, India is one of the most unregulated countries as far as health is concerned. We have virtually a laissez-faire system. Even the countervailing checks and balances that are provided by the insurance companies elsewhere is not available here. We also said there should be adequate community participation through health councils and health assemblies, and we must facilitate also looking at social determinants like gender, urban health, social determinants of health overall, and so on. So our plan was, in terms of the vision, to have universal health entitlement to every citizen, guaranteeing to a set of services well defined, which could be contextualized to each state, primary care certainly to be covered, a good deal of secondary care to be covered, and some elements of tertiary care to be covered. People said, how can you think of tertiary care? It's going to be so expensive. Why do you want to include it in the UHC package? The question is, if a woman who is pregnant has a mishandled delivery and requires treatment for a ruptured uterus or a vesicovaginal fistula, do we say this is tertiary care and turn her back? If a young man in a village gets a snake bite and requires ventilatory support or dialysis, do we say this is tertiary care and turn him back? So we need to include some elements of tertiary care also when they're totally life-saving. And we said this integrated health care should be provided by public sector facilities and by contracted and private providers as per need. So in terms of health financing, increase from 1.2% of GDP to 2.5% at the end of the 12th plan and 3% of GDP by the 13th plan. Use general taxation as the principal source of healthcare financing, complemented by additional mandatory deductions from salaried individuals and taxpayers. Avoid multiple insurance schemes. Even some of the best health economists in the US warn against multiple insurance schemes as fragmenting and inefficient. They suggest a single payer scheme. And yet we have a profusion of schemes here. And since the RSBY is something that we cannot do away with, it's there. Use that platform to extend it effectively into primary health care, secondary health care, and tertiary care link up, and provide the continuity of care and integrate the mushrooming state health insurance schemes and other insurance schemes all into one financing scheme. Focus on primary health care with 70% of all health expenditure being on primary health care, which includes general health information and promotion, curative services at the primary level, and screening of risk factors at the population level. Strengthen public services, especially primary health care in rural and urban areas and district hospitals. Contract and private providers where needed, as per need and availability, but with defined deliverables. We said a private sector contracted partner coming in must work as an extension arm of the public sector. They must agree to take at least 75% of the inpatients and 50% of the outpatients as people who are UHC beneficiaries. they must follow the terms set under the UHC. And we must integrate primary, secondary and tertiary care provision so that we have a seamless continuum of healthcare and follow-up. We also said 3 essential medicines should be distributed by increasing public spending on drug procurement. And by spending just an additional 0.1% of our GDP, which is not too much, we can provide all the medicines in our national list of essential medicines free of cost at public facilities. And the Tamil Nadu model of drug procurement and distribution, which is now about 2 decades old, has proved to be remarkably efficient, and that is something that other states should take it up. We said, like Thailand and Brazil, we must have health councils which provide communities the right of participation, organize annual health assemblies, strengthen Panchayati Raj institutions, bring in the civil society much more powerfully, and institute a formal grievance redressal mechanism at the block level for multiple development programs. In terms of human resources for health, we said we need doubling of ASHAs and auxiliary nurse midwives. We need male multi-purpose health workers and mid-level health professionals, including the new 3-year program, or Ayush with bridge training at the sub-center level. We said the indigenous systems of medicine also must be respectfully integrated into the healthcare system. But ultimately, it is the primary healthcare that requires the maximum number of human resources. And in the urban primary healthcare, we said nurse practitioners will do well. Now, if you have doubts whether this is going to work, a study conducted by my colleagues in Chhattisgarh showed that the people who are trained in the 3-year program did as well or better than the MBBS doctors in diagnosing and treating primary care conditions. In fact, in malaria, they did better. In South Africa, nurses were highly effective in controlling high blood pressure, diabetes, and asthma. In Iran, community health workers successfully managed high blood pressure and diabetes. Iran has one of the best primary healthcare programs in the world. Now, there are models that show that we too can actually use non-physician healthcare providers to great advantage. And in our own foundation, engineers who are working with us within the foundation have developed a Swasthya slate where 33 tests can be performed by trained ASHAs and auxiliary nurse midwives, ranging from blood pressure and blood sugar to quality ECG and water quality, body temperature, and a number of other tests that can be performed at the point of care diagnostics at the home level or the community level. So technology-enabled primary healthcare physicians, primary healthcare providers can be of great value. We also said new medical colleges and nursing colleges are needed, but they should be established in states where currently they do not exist in large number, particularly in districts where they are very few and far between. We said new medical colleges must be linked to district hospitals. Training of medical students must happen in the district hospital so that they get a greater flavor of the primary healthcare system below, with some linkage to the tertiary care system above. We said the number of allied health professionals should be increased and training institutions should be set up, and the district hospital should now host the District Health Knowledge Institute. But regulation has been the weakest element, and therefore we said there should be a National Health Regulatory and Development Authority. It should have an arm which provides the technical for developing standard treatment guidelines, management protocols, quality assurance methods. It should have a legal and financial and regulatory wing, and it should have also a health management information systems wing, plus an independent monitoring and evaluation wing. While at the national level these should be normative, the operational elements again should have counterparts in the state level. There are a number of issues that have been debated and would continue to be debated, whether it should be a tax-funded model or an insurance model. Most countries where UHC has succeeded have gone predominantly for a tax-funded model. Whether the government-funded insurance schemes are having any impact or not, yes, to some extent in providing services, but not in financial protection. The role of private insurance at the moment is limited and should not really be utilized to great advantage in UHC. Let me give you a little anecdote. In RSBY in Kerala, the insurance company who subscribed for a 3-year contract found a huge number of claims, and they found that they had to ask for an increase in their premium rate per capita from 400 in the first year to 800 in the second year. And with the third year, they said, unless you give 1100 rupees, you're going to walk out. So people said, why? Because they said the claims ratios are approaching about 170%. Now, the question was, why is that so? They said, oh, Kerala is a problem. People are highly educated and they want too many health services. God forbid if the rest of India gets educated. Now, therefore, that's the problem. So how many of these insurance schemes are going to be sustainable has to be seen as well. Now, the question was user fee. Now, should you have user fee or not? The World Bank and the IMF came up with a prescription in the late 80s, followed everywhere that user fee is necessary. But now, the same World Bank president, Jim Kim, of course, not the same person, in the World Health Assembly in May this year said user fee is inefficient and unjust because it shuts the door on the poor. So we have to now look at exempting user fee, and we also must ensure that states also start spending more on health, including primary health care. The role of the public and private sectors is going to be contentious. In a mixed health system, you can't ignore the presence of the private sector. And indeed, when you're talking about treating tuberculosis, you can't talk about excluding the general private practitioner. But they have to be brought into the system on the terms set by the government in a well-regulated framework. And there have been other issues also that have been debated. But the key element is to get a continuum of care where primary, secondary, and tertiary care are seamlessly integrated. But what has happened? People have started cherry-picking our recommendations. Rajasthan went ahead with the essential drug scheme. They started supplying the drugs from the National List of Essential Medicines free of cost at public facilities. That had benefit. Whereas impoverishment due to drugs was much higher in Rajasthan than the All India average in 1993 to 94. By 2011-2012, Rajasthan had lower levels of drug-related impoverishment compared to the rest of the country. It was thought that this might win the Chief Minister the election. You know that they got wiped out. And there's a lesson there. Look at the food price inflation in the country. If you look at the amount of food price inflation, it is huge. So while it is important to assure universal health coverage, it is important to bring in essential drugs to the people. It alone is not going to suffice in terms of providing security and accelerating development. And if you do not have food, you can't even have good health. So is there a roadmap? We provided our report in 2011. The 12th plan incorporated several of the elements in 2012. The National Advisory Council recently also reiterated and endorsed the recommendations. But will there be political commitment coming forth in 2014? Whoever is in charge of the center or the states. But at the United Nations level, at 2015, as the race for developing the Sustainable Development Goals moves on, there are two candidates. One is universal health coverage, and second is maximizing health across the lifespan. Even there, universal health coverage will become an important component. But it's very important for us to recognize that health is very critical to other sustainable development goals. Health is linked to education bidirectionally. It's linked to environment bidirectionally. It is linked to poverty alleviation bidirectionally. It is linked to productive livelihoods again bidirectionally. So we need to position health very strongly and universal health coverage within the matrix of health, but not as an isolated element divorced from other sustainable development elements. To conclude, universal health coverage will assure us greater equity, will have greater improved health outcomes, will provide greater financial protection, and if well regulated, will provide an efficient, accountable, and transparent health system. You must recognize that in the state of Uttar Pradesh, 3 chief medical officers died violent deaths because of drug procurement-related scandals. The average life expectancy of a chief medical officer in Uttar Pradesh is lower than that of the average Indian male. So unless we actually manage to bring in greater transparency and accountability, that sorry state of affairs will continue. Of course, universal health coverage will also reduce poverty, will improve productivity, but it will also increase jobs. if you actually focus on primary health care, increase the number of community health workers, nurses, allied health professionals, you will create millions of jobs in this country, which is not only good for the health sector but also good for the economy, because as you know, job creation will revive a sagging economy. Lastly, if we don't create the future, the present extends itself, as Toni Morrison said in the Song of Solomon. The present is untenable. So we have to create the future, and universal health coverage has to be an important part of it. And universal health coverage in a broader dimension, not in a very narrow dimension of a health insurance scheme.
And I would like to express our deep gratitude to Afsar Reddy for his brilliant and remarkable address. I think this is one of the most powerful case that one has heard of instituting universal health care in India, largely financed and guided and controlled by the government. I think he has delineated almost all the important elements of a universal healthcare scheme. He has given powerful and incontestable arguments as to why these elements should be included in the form in which he has described them. There is otherwise a wealth of information in what he has said, and while it sets us thinking, it at the same time gives us the incentive to take initiatives in our own spheres, in our own ways, for getting concrete actions taken in this area. I think we are most grateful to you, Professor Reddy, for this. If you have a little patience for a few minutes, I would like to, instead of repeating what he has said, add some dimensions to the components he has spelled out. First thing I would like to say is that one was really hoping at the time of the formulation of the 12th five-year plan that Government of India would launch a universal healthcare scheme. Prime Minister and the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission had announced that had virtually admitted that the health sector has been ignored and that one needs to give it very high priority. And even mention was made of gradually increasing the percentage of the GNP devoted to health. The very fact that this commission was set up by the Planning Commission itself, and I was personally very hopeful that it was the opportune time for launching a scheme. But unfortunately, it did not happen. And but there is no doubt that it is a necessity and inevitability, and that such a scheme must be launched. Now, a few important elements of this scheme. One that Professor Reddy in the report is mentioned, but it did not bring out, is that it must have a deadline. Because we have been talking about these objectives in a loose way in the field of elementary education. When the Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan was launched some 15 years ago, every 2 years it was said that after 2 years we are going to universalize. And elementary education still remains ununiversalized. And RTE, Right to Education Act, has been adopted, but still 3 years after the implementation of the Act, 75% of its provision, which were supposed to be implemented after 3 years, are not implemented, have not been implemented. So I think that it is no point in just vaguely saying that we are going to do this thing, that thing, or taking things in isolation, and in order to gain popularity or votes, implement one scheme or the other, as Professor Reddy pointed out in relation to Rajasthan. I think the entire scheme in all its aspects should be launched with a time limit to it. Second thing is that there should be a national commitment that the percentage of GDP devoted for public expenditure in health, including both the central government and state governments, should be increased within a particular time limit. I mean, the prescription, the recommendation in the report is from 1.2 to 2.5 by the end of the 12th plan and 3% by the end of the 13th plan. Third thing is that I think the supply of essential drugs. One very important reason why it must be done, apart from poverty, human rights, non-discrimination, equity, is also the way it will help our economy. Because we have one of the most sturdy pharmaceutical industries in the world. And we are capable of producing enough to meet all our needs, not only all our needs, but also to supply to the needy in foreign countries. And if the production is organized to meet an vastly enlarged demand base, which is the demand of the poor, I think this can be a tremendous boost to the industry itself. And it can expand and it can really emerge as one of the most flourishing and the most competitive industries in the world, apart from meeting the demands of the poor and the unprivileged in the country. The second thing is that I think the universal health care in the Commission report, it is recommended that what will include it in this has to be spelled out. And I think that this should be one of the first national priorities. And we should not launch this scheme without this task having been completed. Because we have seen how RTE was, again I'm going to the education field, was not implemented because most of the preliminary steps that needed to be done for its effective implementation was not done. And this brings me down to the importance of the government. I think that private sector has expanded and the extent of expansion has been pointed out by Professor Reddy. But the point is that private sector can at best help in enhancing access. When it comes to equity, affordability, and meeting a particular social need within a time limit, it is not within the capacity of the private sector to do that. Government alone can do that. And therefore, the supreme necessity of government taking an initiative in this area. Another point that I would like to say is that I think there is a very strong case, in spite of our disappointment with the implementation of the RTE, of a right to health services law. Because it makes no sense that you have a right to education legislation based on the extension of the concept of right to life as interpreted by the Supreme Court, and you do not have a similar right to health services education based on the same right to life logic as explained and enunciated by the Supreme Court. This dichotomy defies any understanding and any logic. And the sooner it is done, the better. And I think that the best thing would be that a universal health scheme should be integrated into a right-based approach to health services, into a legislation which guarantees to citizens right to health services, with most of the essential elements of such a scheme being defined within the Act so that it is justiciable, so that people can go to the court and can ensure that it is available to them. Another point that I would like to point out is that internationally there is the TRIPS agreement does not define what is invention, and basically leaves the definition two national governments. In our amended Patent Act, we defined what is invention in a relatively rigorous manner, not in a fully rigorous manner. And that is the ground on which the Novartis patent was not permitted by the Supreme Court of India. Now you see the kind of hue and cry that is being raised in the developed world and by the multinationals because of this judgment by the Supreme Court of India, which is the highest authority in the country. So what is the lesson to be derived from it? Let me also point out to you that one of the greatest authorities on patent laws, that is Carlos Correa, an Argentinian academic, has said that majority of the patents given since the TRIPS agreement came into force are frivolous. And I'm quoting his argument. So there is a strong need to plug this loophole in the TRIPS agreement. And I think that the government of India should take initiative in this direction. Second thing is that the government of India should not accede to any free trade agreement or any other bilateral or regional free trade agreement which provides for TRIPS plus privileges. Because TRIPS is bad enough. And I have made a case for removing these loopholes in TRIPS. But if we agree on something which is TRIPS plus in the direction of accommodating the multinationals, then whatever space that we have of taking care of the needs of our poorest, we will lose that space. And I think that the government of India should not do that. I would also point out that the one point made by Professor Reddy regarding the simultaneous action along with the universal health care scheme in two areas are extremely important. One is that what you do to ensure that social determinants of health are put in place. And I think almost all the social determinants of health are right-based, on the same logic on which the right to education is right-based. And that is the food, that is nutrition, that is sanitation, and that is water supply. And these are the fundamental rights of the people. They are an essential part of right to life. As much as the right to education, it is an essential part of right to life. And the government of India itself has recognized it by enacting a legislation on right to food, on right to employment, which is also a very embedded social determination of health. And I think that these loopholes should be plugged. And the rights in these social determinants should be ensured within a time limit framework as the legal right of the people in a non-discriminatory manner. And finally, I would like to say that, regulatory thing, Professor Reddy has pointed out, I'm afraid the government is interested in enacting laws to regulate, but it is not interested in really regulating. And this is reflected in two things. One is that while enacting the law in none of the areas, and I can go to education, I can go to other areas, the government has created the capacity in the government of being able to regulate. This capacity is singularly lacking, number one. And number two, that such are the vested interests in these fields that perhaps one doubts if there is really a will to regulate, or only making moves to regulate without having the real will to regulate. And I will leave this point at that. Finally, with due apology to Professor Reddy, having been in international arena almost all my life, I would not like to place such a high hope on the right to health being a part of the post-2015 development agenda. This is simply because it is not backed by sovereignty, as is the right to health in India is backed by sovereignty. It is just recommendatory. It is not backed by availability of resources. it is not backed by all other preconditions which must be fulfilled to make it effective. So it is a psychological satisfaction that yes, we have got it in this document also, but nothing beyond that. With these remarks, I would like to stop at that. And I don't know, organizers, is there a time to take questions? Yeah. So we will have some 15 minutes, if you bear with us, to take questions. Yes, sir.
A very powerful vision. The quote, "If we don't create the future, the present extends itself," is very powerful, consistent with the vision we just heard. Another important quote is that past is prologue. And the institutions that we now have are with us. And my question, Professor Reddy, is the vision calls for a supply-driven framework. It kind of moves away from the demand-driven RSPY framework. Can you tell us whether it's whether it'd be more practical to be building fully off the RSPY's framework to provide the demand-driven system rather than the government-framed supply framework that you've articulated? And I say this with utter respect for the vision.
Well, unfortunately, the RSPY experiment has not really looked at primary health care so far. The private sector, by and large, has no appetite for getting into primary health care. They would like to take the position that let the government take care of primary health care. We will take care of tertiary and possibly secondary as well. Now they're looking at the secondary space as well, but they would not like to really touch primary health care because there are multiple health conditions, but which are low cost in terms of payment. So it doesn't really yield. There's going to be a huge demand on their time, but without the same profit lines. So there is absolutely no alternative to the government stepping in very strongly into the primary health care space. And therefore the supply has to be ensured at a variety of levels. Now what happens to the individual urban private practitioner? How is that person going to be integrated into the system? I think the government will have to say that if you accept our conditions, and these are the conditions in terms of these will be the cost of payment for this kind of services, you're welcome to become a partner in this and then try and extend the network. But I don't think you can actually depend upon the RSPY to show the way in which you give the money and say that people will follow the money and then go to the services wherever they are being provided. Because particularly with no regulatory framework being available, you're not going to get quality services and you're not even sure of access to those primary health care services. So the government has to step in a very strong way. I'm not saying that all the levels of services will have to be dealt with in a similar manner. But even if we are bringing in the private sector in tertiary and secondary care, it has to be through a well-regulated framework. Otherwise, it's going to have, firstly, escalating healthcare costs, as you know, from the United States. And it's also going to see a very little control in terms of quality as well. You're never assured of quality if there is no regulatory framework.
Any further questions? Yes.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for such an engaging presentation. My question is regarding, as we all know, we have a deficit of health workers and especially doctors. So government has recommended a 3-year degree program for that to bridge that gap between rural health workers and others. The doctors are not ready, MBBS regular doctors are not ready to go into the rural areas. And on the other hand, they are opposing this kind of 3-year degree program. AIMS is also opposing this kind of proposal. So what are the committee's recommendations regarding this glitch of this problem? And what is your personal opinion regarding this problem?
The 3-year program has been recommended by a committee, has been recommended in the 12th plan, has now been approved in a cabinet note. We are looking at not pseudo doctors, we are looking at mid-level health workers. There is a difference. All over the world, they are looking at mid-level health workers who have been given different types of names. Community health officers, which is what the Indian nomenclature is. In some cases, they're called physician assistants, they're community health assistants, different names are being given. The idea here is, like nurse practitioners, these 3-year trainees also ought to be able to fit in the health system, particularly at the sub-centers, and possibly also at the primary healthcare center, performing a number of public health functions and some basic essential primary care clinical services as well being rendered, for which they can be trained adequately. Even in the national programs now, non-physicians are permitted to dispense certain drugs, like in malaria and so on. So therefore, there need not be a taboo on certain elements of clinical care also being performed. It's not a cop-out in the sense that we can't send doctors there, therefore we are sending sort of substitute for we're sending poor substitutes. No. Actually, even in urban healthcare, we ought to be able to utilize them in primary healthcare settings. Urban primary healthcare, there's no reason why it has to be doctor dependent. Therefore, we ought to get this 3-year program through. We need to get nurse practitioners through. We need to use Ayush training to perform some other functions. Many ways in which we can actually overcome the shortage of doctors. But we cannot hold primary healthcare hostage to the availability of unwilling doctors. At the same time, I would also like to emphasize that we ought to improve the amenities for the doctors to go to rural areas. Both the social amenities as well as the facilities there. There is no point of a doctor being pushed there if you don't have drugs beyond 2 months of supply. There is a stock out. The equipment is extraordinarily poor. They don't even have work satisfaction. So we need to improve that as well.
How much finance is required for complete opening free medicine at Indore?
Well, as far as the free medicine, the calculation is that even currently we are spending a fair amount on medicines in the country, and if we are actually going to be supplying free medicines in public facilities, indoor and outdoor, in public facilities across the country, the cost estimate is around 5,000 crores, which is nothing. On the other hand, if you actually are looking at supplying even through the private sector across the country, then it's about 30,000 crores. Let me start with the public facilities. And in Rajasthan, which I showed, once they started giving medicines, attendance at public facilities started rising because the confidence of the people in the public system was restored. And these are all branded, unbranded, quality assured generics, but quality assured.
Yeah. As a myself, Santosh from Center of Social Medicine, JNU, I have read this whole universal healthcare package, this whole document. In this, so there is one, the conceptualization of the health system, which you said in the WHO's the 1974. There was a disparity between down the line after 1978, the Almaty Conference, the concept of health system became, they conceived the healthcare system as a health system, and it is repeated same here. So even though we say health system, it's the social determinants the inherent part of the health system, and which is not considered the starting point at last. It was mentioned at one point. That's the first. Second, being an Indian democratic country, having why the government is only enabler and guarantor, why not he become a provider? Second, third one is in continuation of the 3 years course. In 2000, it is experimented in Chhattisgarh and Assam. My concern is when we had experimented in 2002, we had a nurse practitioner experimented in West Bengal and continuously in the Uttar Pradesh by IIM Ahmedabad and in NHFIW. Why the nurse practitioner is not implemented in Chhattisgarh? Or why? What is the specialty of having this BSc Public Health or BSc? and I have read your whole UHSC document there. I have seen your stratas various. There in the whole manpower supplement, there no nurses are included. Even the 21% of the health professionals are nurses. Not even single nurse is involved in the planning commission. Why this is a step-further attitude towards the nurses? And you always say the 10th 5-year plan. That's the first plan where we had 100 crores granted for nursing profession. But how it is granted, entirely different issue. Second, why the nurses are not included? Okay.
Let me briefly respond. I would certainly look at the social determinants of health as a part of the broader health system. However, since the WHO, in its greater wisdom, has defined the health system as having these 6 components and has defined the social determinants as separate but linked, that is how the discourses go on for the future. The important element is that the health ministry feels disempowered to deal with some of the social determinants, because it feels it does not have clout with other ministries, whether it is trade or environment or whether it is agriculture systems. I mean, you can't talk about nutrition without talking about agriculture and food systems. But it is important for us to establish these links so that those ministries are not threatened by the health is taking over everything. In fact, I wrote an article once in the Hindu called "Every Minister Should Be a Health Minister." So we need to actually look at how those systems can become more responsive. So let's not quarrel about whether it's part of the health system or not. Let us bring them together. That's the important element. Second question that you asked is about nurses, I think. No, about universal health coverage. If you look at the definition, we said not necessarily the only provider. We didn't say the government should not be the provider. In fact, we are suggesting everywhere that the government should be a key provider. But we recognize in a mixed health system, it cannot be the only provider to bring in others in a responsible manner, well-regulated framework. But the government is a provider, and particularly for primary health care, it has to be the lead provider. But even for secondary and tertiary care also, it has to be an important player in the provision. Third question is nurses. Dr. Leela Callan-Perkey, who is a member of our commission, is a nurse. The fact that she is referred to as a doctor is because she has a PhD. That doesn't stop her being a nurse. And we have referred to nurses very much. We talked about nursing colleges and everything else. We've also talked about nurse practitioners, by the way. In urban areas, we said there should be nurse practitioners, if you read the report carefully. But the problem about the nurse practitioner is not something that we can handle, because it has regulatory issues. The Medical Council of India will not permit nurse practitioners to be trained as nurse practitioners. The Nursing Council of India has not taken an initiative. Unless we remove some of those regulatory barriers, to create nurse practitioners is going to be difficult. The Government of India has been talking about it, the Human Rights Commission of India is talking about it. But as long as the regulatory cobwebs remain, you will find it difficult.
2 more questions.
Hello, sir. My question is, why is there, I mean, the reform process is very well delineated here, but what I'm wondering is, why aren't there any champions for health reform? Why isn't there a political constituency that demands better health rather than, something else? Why isn't there a consensus on this? Even, as you mentioned, the Rajasthan case, the Jan Aushadhi system was supposed to win the party in power, but it didn't happen. So is there something wrong with the electorate, or is it something wrong with the political system?
You see, the issue is what do people feel as their absolute pressing necessities. You see, in the villages, people will see motorable roads, electricity, water supply, all of these are important necessities. Similarly, in urban areas too, they have different needs. Not that people do not recognize health as a need, but when you're overpowered with food inflation and other things, then that becomes your immediate priority. So I think we ought to be able to engage people in the conversation on health and get them to articulate it much better. The late Y.S. Rajshekhar Reddy, when he won the re-election in Andhra, he said he won it because of the 108 scheme, the emergency ambulance scheme, as well as the Aarogyasri scheme. Then other chief ministers started replicating a variety of health insurance schemes. So health has sometimes featured in the political discourse, but now I think other issues, whether it is food inflation or corruption or whatever, they have overpowered everything else. So we have to bring it back into the political dialogue and not give up hope on it just because in Rajasthan something has happened.
Last question.
How many doctors are we producing every year?
I think we are producing somewhere close to 40,000 doctors per year, if I'm not mistaken.
So the target to be made, 2020 target to be made.
No, but then we are talking about new doctors. These are replacement doctors. A lot of people retire, they migrate. I don't think we should depend. We need more medical colleges, but the medical college should be anchored to district hospitals in districts which are currently not being served. No, you can actually improve the district. You ought to see if the district hospital is strengthened, 90% of the problems should be handled at the district level. Only 10% should spill over to large hospitals.
Well, thanks very much. You will now bring this meeting to an end.
Thank you very much, Professor Reddy and Professor Dubey. This is a very comprehensive and insightful session. Thank you very much for emphasizing the need for the government as well as the civil society to come into this as stakeholders, and also to pointing out the interrelatedness between this field and the other development sectors. Without this particular kind of looking at things may not help. So we really need to think collectively. That is the message that is coming through. Thank you very much. And we hope when we come back with the PRISM series next year, we hope to bring continue some of these discourses and to find some areas of continuity, sustainability, and bring them to you. We hope all of you will stay with us. Please go to our website and give your feedback so that we can kind of continue this discourse and also take it to the level of action. So we also request our speakers to continue working with us in their own field, so that if you talk to Dr. Reddy also about this. Thank you very much and healthy New Year.